you mentioned something I want to touch on. You said the app was designed by the Chinese Communist Party. Now, a lot of people would say, well, no, this is a separate, it's its own company. Yes, maybe the CCP can have some influence. But why would you say that? I mean, this is also a broader kind of question about how large Chinese companies operate within China.
Well, I've always viewed any Chinese company, even if it's not necessarily a state-owned enterprise, as basically a dormant state-owned enterprise, because Chinese law, I believe it's Article 7 of their national intelligence law, allows any company that's based in China, a Chinese company, to effectively be requisitioned by the state to serve, they euphemize it as, intelligence purposes, for the safety of the country, but allowing any of these companies, the data they've collected, any of the work they're doing to be used for the ends of the Chinese Communist Party. So I think this fantasy that Chinese companies can exist and not be under the control of the Chinese Communist Party is just that, a fantasy. But even more precisely, or even if you take the legality out of it, you look, even though it's law, you can't. But if you look aside on that issue, I think, like for instance the case of Jack Ma, a lot of these people who run these companies, right, based in China, they know that they need to fall in line. They need to not, speak out against the Chinese Communist Party, not be too critical, or it's not going to end well for them. I think we've seen a lot of regulation of big tech companies over there in terms of at least the ones listed on the stock market. And I just think this narrative, and I think that's something too that a lot of Americans don't understand. It's a Chinese company, it's just based in China, it's not necessarily part of, a branch of the Chinese Communist Party. And while that might be true temporarily, all it takes is 1 second, that switch to be flipped on, and this company that used to be, based in China is now effectively a de facto state-owned enterprise. And I don't think many people understand that. And also too, I think when you understand the way the Chinese Communist Party operates, they use everything at their disposal. And if they see a company like TikTok that has the reach it does into, kids as young as 9 and 10, even though they shouldn't be on the platform, they're still on there. They're going to use that to their advantage. If the Chinese Communist Party is toying around with bat coronaviruses to make them more deadly, I'm pretty sure if they see an app like TikTok just waiting to be requisitioned by them to fill the heads of everyone across the world, but especially young, impressionable minds in America with, a curated version of China or a certain take on an issue, they're definitely going to weaponize that.
And it just something I want to kind of remind viewers of is that the People's Liberation Army, which of course, you made the case earlier about how connected it is with the Wuhan Institute of Virology, is actually the army of the Communist Party, not of China. And that's just an interesting distinction. I'm sure you're aware.
Yeah, I think that distinction is always important to make because I think a lot of times the mainstream media, certain voices love to critique criticisms of the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese system as, racist, right? You're attacking the Chinese people, but it's like nothing could be further from the truth. The people who suffer the most at the hands of the Chinese Communist Party are the Chinese people. So I think that distinction is always very, very, very important to make. And I think it's very interesting too that mainstream media outlets never really pay attention to that nuance, right? The way they describe China is basically the Chinese Communist Party. That's the only kind of group that they ever engage with and take the line of. For instance, with what's going on in Shanghai right now, there's not a lot of reporting on that, at least truthfully, from the mainstream media in terms of the chaos that's going on there, what people are being forced to endure. And I think it's interesting because you see the mainstream media so quickly rushing to take the Chinese Communist Party's side on most issues, especially the origins of COVID-19, yet the Chinese people, who of course lack a free and fair press, right? China Daily, China Global Television Network is probably never going to report truthfully on any of these issues. So I think the Western media has a very, very special role to play in terms of helping the Chinese people kind of overtake the Chinese Communist Party and actually get the truth out because China lacks an actual free press, right? So I think that's what's even more, I think, disheartening and just on a emotional human level so saddening about what has become of mainstream media outlets because the Chinese people need them, need the truth, need actual information, need people to be sharing the horror stories of what's going on in Shanghai right now and across the entire country. But the mainstream media, seems to be okay with it. They'll take the Chinese Communist Party's line, they'll ignore the Chinese people, yet accuse, people like me who say, the Wuhan coronavirus or link COVID-19 to China, and more precisely the Chinese Communist Party, as racist, which in my mind is really just crazy. And I think, we've seen a lot of discourse be kind of degraded into ad hominem attacks, right? Racist, sexist, homophobe, or whatever. But I think it's interesting when you see the mainstream media taking that, I think, very just basic, simple line of attack on the issues to people who want to actually get to the bottom of what the Chinese Communist Party is doing, and they just dismiss, those people as racist or some other silly word that obviously has no merit.
We live in an era of censorship and disinformation, and it can be really hard to know what's true and what's false in this information climate. To get honest information and insights you can trust, join us on Epoch TV. You can sign up for your 14-day free trial at ept.ms/freetrialjan. That's ept.ms/freetrialjan.
To your point, you've done a whole bunch of work around just sort of looking at kind of connections between the CCP and different media. I saw you had a headline about a lot of pretty high profile CNN people going to work for CGTN. I don't want to necessarily dig into that, but on another element, you have Google was funding EcoHealth at some levels as well. And then a recent headline you have is Google funding a leading lab leak denier, right? To go back to our initial topic here. So tell me about this.
Sure. So this again is, I think, another perfect example of just a conflict of interest. So an individual named Charles Kalischer, he was actually the first signatory on the Lancet letter. This came from the Lancet Medical Journal back in February of 2020. And this was a statement, I think it was about 2 pages, basically dismissed, even if you dared to say the word lab leak, you were a conspiracy theorist.
And I just want to jump in here. Has this letter been retracted or anything? I haven't actually, I haven't followed that, but I remember when I saw this, having a background in evolutionary biology and genetics, I thought this is just a preposterous thing. How could Lancet possibly publish something like this? Because the suggestion was there's no way that this isn't natural. I mean, essentially it was the letter, right? Which was a preposterous thing to say with the evidence that was available at the time. And at least you need to look at this, right?
Yeah, so much for the scientific method, but they threw that out the window and wrote this paper basically saying anyone who even dares to utter the words lab leak are conspiracy theorists. And I think they even used the word conclude, which is a pretty strong word, saying that COVID-19 developed naturally. So since its publication in February 2020, the issue about this statement was that a lot of the authors on it, I think it was around 3 dozen, a lot of these scientists, they all said unanimously, we have no conflicts of interest. And one of the other leading signatories, which Freedom of Information Act requests had actually showed emails that this individual, Peter Daszak, was the leading orchestrator of this statement. Well, he had been a longtime collaborator, that's a direct quote using the words of Shizheng Li of the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
Finally, I would like to thank all the collaborators, particularly my long-term collaborator from Linfa Wang, Peter Daszak, and Ralph Barrick.
This is someone who has worked with Wuhan for a very long time. We had unearthed clips of him speaking actually in Washington, D.C., I think back in 2016, talking about how he was working on, quote, killer viruses with his colleagues in Wuhan. So this is someone who is, knee-deep in Wuhan Institute of Virology compromise, yet he said, I have no conflicts of interest, which was just a absolutely preposterous statement to make. So we had been reporting on that for a while. Peter Daszak's ties to Wuhan and ties to the Chinese Communist Party more broadly. But I would say about maybe a little over a year after the statement's publication, what they did issue, now we would say it was basically a retraction, but technically, I guess, legally it wasn't. But what they put on there was an admission of conflicts of interest for Peter Daszak. And subsequently, Peter Daszak was actually removed from the Lancet COVID-19's Origins Investigative Committee. The Lancet had several branches that were doing different aspects of COVID-19 work.